We got so many things to talk about. Oh my God. Let's get down to business. Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. Today I have another wrap up. I can't believe that April's already over. I feel like April went by so much faster than March did. March felt like it took 8 million years. And while in March I read 16 books, in April I also read 16 books. So definitely an absolutely amazing month, but like, what else was I gonna do? Let's get into the breakdown. I read 16 books. That's 3,406 pages, which isn't a lot because again, there was a lot of audio and there were a lot of ebooks as well. That averages out to about 114 pages a day. And it ended up being 67 hours of audio. However, I listen at least 2 times speed, sometimes a little bit more. So since it's 2 times speed, it ends up only being about 33 and a half hours of audio. And of all of those 16 books, only one of them were rereads. With our formatting, I read 3 physical books. I read 7 ebooks, one of which was an e-arc from NetGalley, and I listened to a total of 6 audiobooks. Of those books, none of them were from the library. Most of my audiobooks were actually either purchased from Audible or I listened to them on Scrib. I did read 4 books out of Kindle Unlimited this month. And then my genre breakdown, this was an extremely horror heavy month. It was just all I wanted to read this month, as I'm sure you can tell from like all of my other content. I did read 3 science fiction books and 1 fantasy and 1 contemporary though. So there were a couple of things mixed in that weren't horror. For star breakdown, again, good month. I didn't have any 2 or 1 star, so that's pretty great. I did read 3 5-star books, 7 4-star books, and 6 3-star books. And then my male to female author ratio this month was exactly half and half, 8 female and 8 male authors. So because there are so many books and because most of them are horror, I am gonna go ahead and start with the horror content. If you are not here for horror content and you do not care, I'm going to try and put a comment link with timestamps down there somewhere for you to click to whatever book you were interested in hearing about. All right, it's time to dive in. The first book that I picked up was one of my Kindle Unlimited selections, and it is Seed by Anya Allborn. I've read several books by Anya Allborn and have absolutely loved them. This was no exception, and I did rate it 4 stars. So this is about a family unit, mother, father, 2 kids. They are driving down the road one evening and something runs out in front of the car and they're in a pretty bad accident. Well, here's the problem. Only the father and the daughter saw what ran out in front of the car, the youngest daughter. The older daughter and the wife didn't see anything. But the youngest child was hit in the head and subsequently after this begins acting very strangely. And the father becomes very concerned because of his childhood and things that happened in his childhood. I won't spoil anything else from there. I think that it's better for you to kind of go in and figure everything out on your own. I really loved this. I thought that, first of all, it takes place in, I believe, Louisiana. And one of the things that Allborn does really well, a lot of her stories take place in like the southeastern United States. And I really appreciate that, seeing as I live in the southeastern United States. And she writes those settings very well. And I think that they just lend themselves to the type of horror that she writes. So she writes her settings very strongly. Also, this family unit is very believable. There have been many books that I've read. The family just doesn't feel like a real family. The interactions don't necessarily feel real. She did that very well in this one. There are definitely points where it's pretty gruesome. The way that she builds the suspense leading up to the ending, which was phenomenal, by the way, was just really well done. I wouldn't say that this is my new favorite of hers, but between this and Double Crept In, those are definitely my 2 favorites. Really, really liked this one. From there, I decided to pick up another Kindle Unlimited book, and that is I Am Not Your Final Girl by Claire Holland. This is a poetry collection, and I'm not usually one that's into poetry. This is one that you guys probably saw in the What's on My Kindle video, which I'll link up above in case you want to check that out if you haven't already seen it. So if for some reason you're not familiar with what a final girl is, a final girl is typically in a horror film, the very last girl who's left who, you know, is supposed to make it out alive, right? What Holland did in each of these poems is each of them are dedicated to about a final girl from a horror film. Now, some of them aren't necessarily final girls, they're just, you know, women that were in those films. but I think that the way that it was written was really well done. A lot of the films I hadn't seen, so I didn't really have any context for maybe what she was talking about. It's extremely feminist. In the very beginning of the collection, in the author's note, like, she wrote some stuff that really like spoke to me. There were a couple of them where after I read them, I had to like really sit back and like think about it for a minute. Very well written, very gruesome. A lot of them were pretty gruesome, obviously with them being horror films, but it was really enjoyable. If you're a fan of poetry and a fan of horror, I definitely recommend picking this one up. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, it is free to read. Next, we're going to talk about another Anya Ahlborn book, which we're going to talk about 4 of those in total. So this is number 2, but I decided to read The Bird Eater. I rated this one about 3.5 stars. This is about a man who returns back to his hometown, back to the house that he grew up in, after his life is sort of falling apart. He's estranged from his wife after the death of his son, and he's really gone there to try and fix up the house. He's going to fix up the house that he lived in as a child. He's going to sell it. He's going to get clean and sober, and he's going to be able to reconnect with his wife after this. But it turns out that going back to that house is really the last thing that he should have done, because things start happening and it becomes clear that there may be a malevolent presence in the house with him that could have caused certain events in his life to go astray. Like I said, I don't necessarily feel like this was as strong as Seed, but it was still a fun read. One of the things that I think that she did really well was the element of grief that she wrote in. You know, this man is estranged from his wife and he has lost his son, and you really felt that, like that came across through her writing, which is really good. The one thing that I really did not enjoy about this book is we have this character where, first of all, he left the house after a tragedy to begin with. And he was, I think, in high school. He was in like either late middle school, early high school or something. And he just disappeared, right? So there was him, and he had 2 very good friends, one of which was a female. And this female, they, I think, had maybe like fallen in love or something before he disappeared. Then he disappeared. So, you know, she moved on with her life and got married. So then when he comes back into town, she like immediately falls back in love with him and is like, oh, well, like I never stopped loving him, and because he just disappeared and I never knew what happened. And I'm like, girl, did you really not move on with your life? Did you really? That aspect of it felt a little bit forced to me. I just didn't love that. But aside from that, I thought that the book was pretty good. Again, in that southern setting, at a rickety ass old house in the middle of the woods. She does that setting so well. Like the way that she writes that, you really feel like you're there. And it's one of the things that I love most about her writing. So aside from the really cringe romance element, it wasn't even a real romance, but aside from that, I thought that it was enjoyable and I would still recommend it. So the next book that we are going to talk about is one of my 5-star reads, and I absolutely love this. I actually did read this as an ARC from NetGalley, but since I have gotten my physical copy, and that is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I loved this book so much, okay? I, as all of you know, am a really big fan of Grady Hendrix's writing anyway, but I think that this is his best work to date, honestly. This was described to me as Steel Magnolias and Fried Green Tomatoes meets Dracula. What about that is not appealing, okay? As a Southern woman, I'm about it. The setting takes place in Old Town in Mount Pleasant, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. Hi, I'm from South Carolina. I know the places that it talks about in here, and I love that about this book. It's so much easier for me to really visualize where the setting is and what's happening. You know, it's easy for me because I've been there, but I think that even someone who hadn't been there, you would still be able to visualize it really well. So anyway, that's one of the things that I love most about this book. But this story is about a Southern book club. You have Patricia. She's kind of in a rut in her life, in a sense. She has 2 kids. She's married. Her husband is a psychologist, psychiatrist, something along those lines. But she gets involved with a book club, and this book club, they read the macabre. They read true crime and you know, horror and things of that nature. And so one day a new neighbor moves in and things start happening, and you start to wonder, is he a vampire? Is he a vampire, or is Patricia reading too many true crime novels and too many horror novels? So you have to find out, right? I did really enjoy the group dynamic of the women that were in the book club. I thought that was really well written, especially having been written by a male author. Sometimes when you're writing groups of women, it can come across as not all that great. But I think that Hendricks did a really good job with it. Again, I just really enjoy his writing style. He has moments that are almost comical, but he upped the ante in this book. I really felt like there was a moment where I was reading this. I ended up reading it in 2 days. It was like 3 or 4 sittings that I read it in. And there was a moment where I was reading it and something was happening, and it was so tense. After I was done, I literally got up and walked around my house to make sure that the doors were locked. And it was one of those things where it really made you wary of what's like lurking in the shadows. And I applaud any book that can do that to me, because it doesn't happen all that often where I literally will get freaked out while I'm reading it. And he did that, and I loved it. Another thing, obviously, we know that this is a vampire book. That's not a spoiler, but he kind of takes a little bit of a different approach to the vampire trope, and I did really enjoy that. It felt good. It felt fresh. As opposed to, say, your traditional Dracula or your, Anne Rice Interview with a Vampire. That was really good. And then he also took the time to sort of explore a couple of different, like, socioeconomic issues that were a thing during that time. And I wasn't expecting that, but I did think that he handled it really well. So, yeah, I really, really loved this book. I 100% recommend it. Most people that I have seen have also really liked it. So, I feel like it lived up to the hype 100%. Even if maybe you didn't love Grady Hendrix's writing, if you've read any of his other, I've seen people that couldn't really get into horror store. And if that's the case, I would still recommend you try this out, because it was phenomenal. So from there, I actually ended up reading another 5-star book, and this is a novella, Come Closer by Sarah Gran. I fucking loved this. It was very short. I read it in 2 sittings. And this is the story of Amanda. She kind of has everything. She has a really nice apartment with her husband, and she is in a really good position in her job, and her life is just going very well. Like, they have a routine and it's good. Her and her husband fight sometime, but let's be real, what couples don't? And all of a sudden, one day, she starts hearing kind of a tapping in her apartment, and from there, things begin to devolve. She really starts to become someone different, and you're watching as she's trying to figure out exactly what's going on with her. I don't want to say too much other than that. I feel like the less you know, the better. It's really well written, and it was really compelling. One of the things that I really loved about this novella is there is this sort of ambiguous aspect to it. You can see things one way, but you can also see things another. And it's like, do you have an unreliable narrator, or is something else going on? Is it really what they're telling you that it is, or is it something else? I just really love books like that really make you wonder. I love that ambiguity for the most part. Really, really recommend. 5 stars, loved it. The next one that I decided to pick up, I was still after that like horror atmosphere. I was really digging that all month. I don't know why. It just, like, it is what I wanted. Like, my heart just wanted it so much. So I decided to pick up Devil Crept In by Anya Auburn. Again, this is one that you guys have seen me recommend so many times, so I'm not really going to talk about what it's about. I just really love the atmosphere that Auburn is able to convey through this book. I was a little bit scared that this being a reread, I did read it 2 years ago, I think in 2018. I was a little bit scared that it wasn't going to live up, that I was going to read it again and it was going to lose something, but I'm happy to report that it did in fact hold up. I still got that vibe. I got that atmosphere that I was craving. This is like a 4.5 star read for me. I really, really like it. Next, I don't really know why I decided to pick this up, but I did, and that is The Terror by Dan Simmons. This thing is fucking huge. And I read this half physically and then half on audio as well. And it took me a while to get through it. I ended up rating it 3.5 stars. I really wanted to love this. It has a lot of really high reviews. One thing that I will say is I really do appreciate Dan Simmons and his writing. He has such a beautiful writing style. I really saw that when I read Summer of Night and A Winter Haunting. He just has this wonderful, wonderful writing style. It really is beautiful. However, this book was too long. This is the story of 2 ships. One of them is the Terror, and I can't remember the name of the other one. They are on a mission to find the Northwest Passage, and while they are trying to do this, they become trapped in the ice. They become trapped in the ice for a very long time, a matter of years actually. Slowly they begin to run out of food. There is the threat of mutiny, in addition to the fact that they're battling the elements because they are in subarctic temperatures. In addition to, there is some kind of creature that is attacking them off of the ice. So one of the things that I really loved about this book is the fact that the terror has so many different meanings. There is, again, the most obvious is it's the name of the ship, but there's a lot more going on to this. That was one of the things that I really appreciated, was the layering of that, right? This is part horror and part historical fiction. Simmons spends a lot of time going through and talking about the everyday minutia of just the everyday bullshit that they had to deal with. In addition to, I read the symptoms of scurvy probably 8 million times while I was reading this book. And it's like, all right, we know, we get it. You don't have to spend a whole page telling me again for the 40th time. There were just a lot of things that I felt like could have been cut out. Once you have described that thing once, maybe 2 times, all right, we get it, we remember, move on. And I understand that this was partially told from different perspectives of different people and diary entries and things like that. And so I understand why each person may explain that in a different way, but it didn't make for good writing. It didn't make for a good book. I don't think him being more concise would have taken away from really understanding that group dynamic of these shipmates and, how things escalated the way that they did. I really don't think that having been a little bit more concise would have changed that in any way. The other thing that I didn't necessarily love about this book is this was actually published in 2007. It's basically historical fiction for a good part of it. It does take place in whatever fucking year that was, the 1800s, I don't remember. 1845. One of the elements, they're, in subarctic Canada or whatever. And one of the things that they run into are the indigenous people of that area. And I understand that in the 1800s that they thought of indigenous people as savages for a multitude of reasons. However, this book wasn't written then. I feel as though you could have expressed crew members' distaste for indigenous people in a more subtle fashion. The way that the indigenous people were discussed was honestly kind of gross. And again, I understand when it takes place, but you are writing in that era from a modern age, right? So the way that I see things is you can't read an older book through a modern lens, right? When you know better, you do better. You can't look at, say, something that is racist or something that is sexist from a book that was written in the 60s or the 70s and say that is gross, that book is bad, because you have to understand what things were like during that time. This was written in 2007. So we're not talking about, yeah, it was 10 years ago, but we're not talking about the 60s, we're not talking about the 70s. And so I do feel like he could have expressed why they would have felt a distaste toward the indigenous tribes that they came in contact with in a different way than he did. The other thing that was very interesting to me is you get towards the end of the book and there is a lot of folklore from indigenous tribes, and I would be very interested to know what his research process was about that. Is that something that he came up with on his own? Is that actual folklore from some tribes in that area? What did that look like? And that to me was the best part of the book, and I don't even know if it's authentic. I wanted to love this a lot more than I did, and I really hate that I didn't love it as much as I did. It's not terrible, and a lot of people rated it so highly, 4 and 5 stars. So I'm definitely in the minority on this. I think that I also did myself a disservice on the fact that I read it whenever it's 80 fucking degrees outside. I think that had I saved this for the winter months, I might have been a little bit more drawn into the atmosphere and the cold and things like that. So I would recommend, if you're wanting to pick this up, maybe waiting until it's colder. I think that that's gonna make it a little bit more atmospheric for you. But I mean, it wasn't a bad book. There were just some problems that I had with it. So, Next, I listened to The Good House by Tana Nareeb-Due. If you are not familiar with her, I actually wasn't until fairly recently. I had this book on my TBR as a book I wanted to read for a while, but then I was watching the horror documentary on Shudder, Horror Noir, which is all about like Black horror. It was very, very interesting. And she appears on that documentary. After watching that documentary, I was like, all right, I really want to read one of her books. This one was very good. I gave it 4 stars. I did listen to the audio. This is the story of the Toussaint family. Angela and her family have had this house, the Good House, in their possession for many generations. However, a family tragedy has caused her to really go away from the house, and you know, it has drastically changed her life and who she is. So she decides that she is going to go to the house. She's going to get it ready. She's probably going to sell it. It's just time. It's time to move on. It's time to move on and try and get her life back. However, once she goes back, she eventually finds out that she's going to have to face whatever force it is that caused her family tragedy to begin with. So again, first of all, let's applaud the fact that this is female written horror and this is written by a Black woman. Anyway, I'm a huge fan of character-driven stories, and that is one thing that she did really well in this book. They were believable and they were flawed and they were dynamic and they changed as the story progressed. Even some of the characters that didn't appear in the book for the whole time were like very, very authentic to me. The writing itself was very beautiful. It was very dark. It was very fluid, but the characters are really what made this book shine. This is a longer book and it does take it a second to get going and to really find its pace, but once it finds it, like it's really good. But it was a really well done book. I really look forward to reading more of her work. Next is the last Anya Alborn book, and that is The Neighbors. So this is the story of Drew, who has an agoraphobic mother, and he is taking care of her for a very long time. He comes from kind of a shitty family life, and after a very big argument between him and his mother, he's in his early 20s, I believe. He is like, you know what? You need to fend for yourself. I gotta get out of here. I gotta handle my own business. So he does, right? He ends up reconnecting with an old childhood friend and moves in with him on a street. The house that they live in is kind of a shithole, and it's on this really nice street. And he becomes entwined with the neighbors who live across the street, and they just feel like this perfect couple. You know, they really are this like perfect couple living in this perfect house, and they have this perfect life. And then, you know, we find out that things are a little bit more sinister than they seem, right? I could see this being like a slasher film. 100%. Not that that's a bad thing. I ended up giving this book only 3 stars, and they were like, for the most part, it was okay, but there were a couple of really big problems that I had with it. You know, there's nothing supernatural about the story. It's literally just people fucking suck. That is literally it. It is people are terrible, and that's it. So my biggest problem, my 2 biggest problems with this book are, and I am not going to like mention characters because I guess you could almost look at this as a slight spoiler. So if you really want to go into this book blind, by all means, skip over this and go to the next book. I need to just point this out because this is one thing that I really, really hate. Sexual trauma should not be used as a plot device and as a reason for a character to do terrible things. I just don't think that that is empowering in any capacity. I think that it is shitty. I think that it's like, I get that these characters are supposed to be hateable, you know, but using that as an excuse, I feel like you're supposed to sympathize for them a little bit more, and I don't believe in that shit, okay? That being said, there are some things that are discussed in this book that are really intense from that perspective, sexual trauma. So if that is something that you are not prepared to read, I don't recommend reading this book at all. Another problem that I had with this is that you have a character who participates in like what some people would consider deviant sexual behavior. I don't look at it as deviant sexual behavior. I don't, and the thing that pissed me off about it is it's really like the things that this character wanted done to them are really not that outlandish. But this character was like, oh my God, I am such a bad person and I'm so fucking weird because I want this done to me. And it's like, stop. Like, you're really not. Like, 60% of the population probably participates in things that are very similar in what you're talking about. And I don't know if that was meant to be commentary on what we are made to believe. I'm really not sure, but it just irritated me so much. Like, I didn't find it to be empowering in any way. Those two things in particular really rubbed me the wrong way about the story. If those things weren't included, like, okay, cool, we've got a slasher film in a book, like, I'm down for it. But the rest of it just, I was not a fan. The next book that I read is Burnt Offerings by Robert Marasco. This is one that was recommended to me in my haunted house video, and I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars. This is an older book, so I don't really see it talked about all that often, but I think that it's considered by a lot of people to be a horror classic. So this is about the Rolfe family, and they live in this shitty little apartment in Queens, and it's the summer, and they want to get the hell out. Like, they just need to get out of the apartment. They need to get out of the city. They need some rest and relaxation, right? The wife, whose name I do not recall, starts looking at, like rentals and stuff. And the husband agrees, you know what, if we find the right thing, we'll do it. So they find this listing that's just too good to be true. They go and see the house and fall in love with it. It's this huge house, and it ends up being really reasonable in price. The only other thing that they have to do is the brother and sister who own the home, they're going on vacation. I think they're supposed to stay like 2 months. The only thing that you have to do is take care of our dear mother who lives upstairs. The only thing that you need to do is just like leave a tray in her like sitting area or something. Like, you'll hardly ever see her. You won't even know she's there. Everything's good, right? So this offer just sounds way too good to be true, right? That's because it is. It's too good to be true. This book read really quickly, and again, one of the things that I enjoyed, I've already talked about this, is that kind of ambiguity. It's like it's a very silent horror, if that makes any sense. The author never really comes out and tells you what's happening through this. There is no, this house is haunted, you know what I mean? There is none of that. You're really left, as the story progresses and as these things begin happening to the characters, you're really left trying to decipher exactly what's going on. And I think that that just adds to that general atmosphere of the story. And I really, really loved that aspect of it. The characters themselves were like pretty one-dimensional. They weren't very deep. But you didn't need that to really like drive the story and to really like feel some type of way about it. Like, you didn't need any of that. It was really well done. I really enjoyed it. I would read more of his books for sure. And the last horror book that I read was another 5-star book, and this is actually the last book that I finished for the month, and that's A God in the Shed. Wow, I really loved it. So this is the story of Saint Ferdinand. Saint Ferdinand has been menaced by a serial killer for years, right? Well, they have finally apprehended a suspect, but the killings don't stop. So did they really apprehend the suspect? I didn't really have any expectations going into this, and it was even more pleasantly surprising when the book delivered the way that it did. The writing was really fluid. The story just kept moving right along, and the writing itself not only was fluid, but it was really beautiful. There was this whole section where it like talked about regret and what that looks like and how we end up with regrets and like how that affects us. That just was like really poignant, and I was left kind of like thinking about that for a minute. Like, it took me a moment to sit back and go like, there's so much truth to that little passage. Like, I really enjoyed that aspect. Parts of it were really gross. It's definitely a horror book, and there is this like occult supernatural element to it that I also wasn't really expecting, and I did very much enjoy it. The descriptions of our killer, whenever we inevitably find out who our killer is, were really good. I was really able to picture it. Really creepy, really atmospheric. The prologue, even at the beginning, was like really good. It pulled me right in, and I loved it. The one thing that did take away with it is, it takes place in this town, so there is like a decent cast of characters. And so sometimes it can be a little bit confusing because you're going from different characters' perspectives. And so I did find that to be a little bit jarring at times. It took you a minute to really ingratiate yourself with each character as you got into their passages or their chapters. But for the most part, like, again, I did really, really enjoy this. So now we're in the not horror section. Sci-fi. I read the entire Southern Reach trilogy. I listened to it on audio. This consists of Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance. And it was just okay. The strongest one of the bunch was definitely the first, Annihilation. That one was a reread for me, so I lied. I did reread the 2 books. Whoops, my bad. But what it's about, someplace on the coast of Florida, there's like this alien entity that has just like popped up, and nobody really knows what it is, how it got there, why it's there. So they keep sending teams in trying to figure out exactly what it is and what it's doing there. Annihilation is the story of 4 women that go into Area X and, you know, kind of what they discover there, right? I'm not going to talk about each book individually. As I said, I do feel like the first book is the strongest. I think that it definitely kind of lost something as it went on. The second book was probably the weakest. The third really kind of wrapped everything up and, you know, pulled everything together, but I still didn't love that as a whole. I will say, if you are watching the film Annihilation and reading the book, I was surprised because I read the book and then I watched the movie directly after. And I was surprised at how different the movie and the book was. However, as I continued reading the trilogy, the film more encompasses aspects from the trilogy itself versus just the first book. So know that going into it. I mean, it was enjoyable. It was a good sci-fi read. It reads very clinically, I will say that. But the descriptions and stuff are also very good. I would say I probably enjoyed Born, which is another one of his books, a little bit more than I enjoyed the trilogy as a whole. But the next book, I lied again. My library book this month was Blood of Elves, which is the first book in the Witcher series. I'm not going to talk about what the Witcher series is because I feel like most people are familiar with it. I will say that if you are going to start the Witcher series, I would very much recommend reading The Last Wish before you read Blood of Elves. Reading The Last Wish really gives you some background to The Witcher and the universe and some of the stories that eventually come into play within the first book. This is the main story. So if you've watched the Netflix series, which is fantastic, by the way, I really loved it. But if you've watched the Netflix series, the end of the Netflix series is the beginning of Blood of Elves. So most of the series is actually stuff from The Last Wish. But I really enjoyed the writing, I think, which is funny because it is a translated work. I think that the translation, that just speaks to the caliber of the translation. But I did really enjoy the story as a whole. It is really easy to visualize. And I don't know if that's because I've seen the series or not, but like I was really able to visualize, and the way that it was written also made it really easy to visualize as well. So if you're looking for like a good high fantasy series, like I would recommend. I thought that it was really good. I'm looking forward to continuing the series as well. And the very last book I'm going to talk about today is the one contemporary that I read this month, and that is The Mars Room by Rachel Kushner. This book was just okay. So this is a story about Romy, and she is currently about to serve 2 consecutive life sentences in a women's prison. This is a book that took me a minute to digest. After I finished it, I had to sit on it before I could really rate it, and I ended up rating it at about 3.5 stars. This is a book that definitely explores like the jail hierarchy as well as different social and economic factors that can lead to incarceration, really what the prison hierarchy system looks like in a women's prison as well as in a men's prison. However, I will say that I feel like parts of this, it's not a very long book, but I feel like parts of it, she was just like beating you over the head with this idea over and over and over. And it's like, all right, do you not trust that I have figured out what this is about, you know? In addition to the fact that not only are we learning Romy's story as, you know, she's going through the intake process and how she got to where she is, but there's a couple of little like side stories that that also explored like a men's prison and somebody who works in a prison and things like that I just sort of felt at times were a little bit unnecessary. You know, I didn't necessarily think that they added anything to the book as a whole. And mostly because it's just, you're exhibiting the same thing over and over and over. You weren't bringing anything new to the story. So again, like, you're beating me over the head with it. Like, please stop. The other thing that was very strange to me is The Mars Room is the name of the book. It is mentioned almost none in the book. Romy was a stripper, by the way, who worked at the Mars Room briefly until she committed her crime. It doesn't take place in the Mars Room, so like I don't understand why it was called that. But whatever. So yeah, it was 3.5 stars. It wasn't like, it didn't wow me. I honestly probably won't keep it. I'll probably end up unhauling this. So those are all the books that I read. That was a lot of books. So that's all I have for you guys today. Have you read any of these books? Comment down below. Let me know what you thought of them. Please remember, do keep it spoiler free for those people that have not read them yet. If you do wish to discuss spoilers, you can look in the down bar below. You can get at me on Twitter, Goodreads, or Instagram. If you are new here, hi, hello, and welcome. If you like what you see and you want to see more, you can click thumbs up. You can hit subscribe if you haven't already. You can click the little bell icon to be notified whenever I upload. And that's pretty much it. So thank you guys so very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.